The Pacific Coast Highway wound like a ribbon of asphalt along the edge of a world where land and sea collided with dramatic, unending force. For Mark, a man whose life had been stripped down to its most essential elements, this view was a kind of therapy. He drove his well-worn truck, a vehicle with more dents than a used golf ball, every weekend from their modest home in Monterey to the untamed stretches of Big Sur. It was a ritual he shared with his 7-year-old daughter Lily, a way to anchor themselves to something constant and powerful. 3 years after losing his wife, the grief was no longer a fresh wound, but a part of his foundation, and these outings were the way he continued building a life on top of it. Lily, a whirlwind of energy with an infectious laugh, was the center of Mark's universe. He had spent his life as a builder, a man who worked with his hands, shaping wood and steel into homes. Now, his most important job was to build a safe and happy world for his daughter. She bounced in the passenger seat, a small, worn sketchbook and a pack of crayons clutched in her hands, her bright red sneakers almost touching the dashboard. "Dad, do you think we'll see any whales today? The school librarian said they're heading south." "I don't know, kiddo," Mark replied, a smile creasing his tired eyes. "But we can hope. Let's find that trail we talked about, the one with the tide pools." They pulled off the main highway onto a gravel turnoff, the air growing thick with the scent of salt and dry earth. They followed a narrow trail that snaked through coastal chaparral, the wind whipping at their clothes. As they rounded a bend, the landscape opened up, revealing a breathtaking vista. The cliff face dropped away sharply, thousands of feet of sheer rock giving way to the churning cobalt blue of the ocean. It was a sight of magnificent beauty and inherent, bone-deep danger. A little further down the trail, a group of people had set up a scene that felt alien to the wildness of the place. A woman, a vision in a flowing white wedding gown, stood on a narrow finger of rock that jutted precariously out over the void. The wind caught the delicate fabric of her dress, making it billow and dance like a white flag against the endless blue. She was radiant, a picture of joy and expectation, her smile wide for the camera held by a man with an impatient, sharp-edged tone. "One more, Sarah. Just a little closer to the edge. Perfect. Look at the water. Chin up. Perfect." Mark felt an immediate, prickling sense of unease. He had a deep, almost instinctual understanding of how things were built and how they fell apart. His years working with rock and concrete had taught him to read the subtle language of the earth. He stopped, his hand firmly grasping Lily's. "Hold on, Lils," he whispered, his eyes narrowing. What he saw was something nobody else seemed to notice. The ground beneath the bride's feet wasn't a solid bedrock, but a thin, weathered shelf of sediment and compressed earth. A tiny, almost imperceptible crack, a dark seam in the rock, ran from beneath the ledge and disappeared into the brush. Erosion was a constant battle here, and the recent unseasonable rains and tremors had weakened the already fragile cliff face. He tried to shake off the feeling, to tell himself he was being overly cautious. But then he saw the bride, Sarah, shift her weight slightly, her satin heels digging into the fragile ground. A low, grinding groan, swallowed by the roar of the ocean, resonated through the earth. A small, fist-sized rock detached from the side of the cliff and tumbled into the abyss, a silent warning. The photographer, obsessed with his perfect shot, was oblivious. The bride's face, for a fleeting second, held not joy, but a flicker of genuine fear. She had felt it. The ground was not solid. Mark's mind raced, a rapid-fire calculation of time and distance. The photographer was urging her to turn, to get a better angle. This was it. Mark knew with a terrifying certainty that he had only seconds. A deep, primal instinct, the same one that had made him a protective father, surged to the forefront. He looked down at Lily, her small, innocent face full of curiosity. The choice was not even a choice. He pulled her behind a sturdy boulder, his hands firm and reassuring. "Stay right here, honey. Don't move." She looked at him with wide eyes, a question forming on her lips, but he was already gone, his boots pounding against the trail, the world narrowing down to a single, urgent mission. The crack beneath Sarah's feet widened with a sickening, audible crunch. A wave of nauseating dread washed over her as the ground gave way, not in a single dramatic crash, but in a terrible, slow-motion collapse. She felt the shelf of rock lurch forward, pulling her into a dizzying fall. A scream caught in her throat, a sound of pure terror that was instantly drowned out by the thunderous roar of the cliff as it began its descent into the churning waves below. From the trail, Mark saw it all unfold. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an agonizing moment. He lunged forward, a surge of adrenaline overriding the pain in his old knees. He didn't think, he just acted, propelled by a force beyond himself. He dove, arms outstretched, his body a blur of motion against the backdrop of the falling earth. He managed to catch her, his fingers closing around her arm with a grip born of a desperate will to save. The momentum of the collapsing rock shelf tore at them both, pulling them down. Mark dug his heels into the remaining solid ground, his muscles screaming in protest. The force slammed them against the edge, scraping their bodies against the unforgiving rock. They lay there, breathless and tangled, a raw mass of fear and pain, just inches from the new, jagged and terrifying drop. The sound of the cliff section hitting the water below was a concussive boom that vibrated through their very bones. Dust and the smell of pulverized rock filled the air. Sarah's pristine white gown was now a canvas of dirt and blood. She was shaking, her eyes wide with shock. Mark's arm was bleeding from a deep gash, a dark line against his weathered skin, and he was covered in bruises. Lily's frightened sobs were the only sound he could hear clearly above the ringing in his ears. He crawled to her side, ignoring the sharp pain. "I'm okay, baby," he said, his voice raspy. "I'm okay. You stay put, just like I said." The photographer, having finally snapped out of his shock, was a hysterical wreck, pacing and screaming into his phone. It was then that Sarah's fiancé, David, came running up the trail. He was a polished man, his clothes designer casual, his face a mask of shock. But his first words weren't for Sarah. "My God, Sarah, what happened? The dress? I hope we can get it cleaned. We paid a fortune for it." His tone was one of exasperation, a man worried about an inconvenience, not a tragedy. The words hung in the air, a shocking, cold note of discord. Sarah looked at him, then at Mark. Mark, a stranger whose face was smudged with dirt, his arm bleeding, his every muscle aching from the effort, had asked her only one question. "Are you okay?" The contrast was a painful revelation. The paramedics arrived, followed by the fire department, their sirens a wail of professional calm against the raw chaos of the scene. They carefully extricated Sarah and Mark, their movements precise and reassuring. As they were being loaded onto separate stretchers, the paramedic attending to Sarah held up a small, glittering object. "Is this yours, Mum?" It was her wedding ring, bent and scuffed, but intact. She looked at it, then at Mark, who was having his arm bandaged. She squeezed his hand, a silent thank you that held more weight and emotion than 1,000 words. He just nodded, his gaze unwavering and kind. In that moment, a bond was forged between two strangers, a connection born of shared peril and genuine humanity, leaving the selfish, shallow man who was supposed to love her on the outside looking in. Weeks later, the physical wounds had begun to heal, but the emotional scars were still fresh. Mark's arm was out of the sling, his stitches were gone, and he was back at work, though the story of the Big Sur hero had become a local news sensation. He was a private man, and the unwanted attention was unsettling. He didn't feel like a hero, he had simply acted. The real reward was seeing Lily's newfound admiration for him and the continued messages from Sarah. For Sarah, the healing was a much more complicated process. The incident had served as a stark, undeniable line in the sand. David's reaction, his continued focus on the financial loss of the wedding and the embarrassment of the ruined photos, had been a clear signal of his true character. The engagement, a promise made on a carefully curated image of a perfect life, could no longer stand up to the harsh reality of a near-death experience. The conversation where she broke it off was short and devoid of the tears and drama she had expected. There was just a quiet certainty that they were wrong for each other. The cliff collapse had done more than just injure her. It had shattered the illusion she was living. One cool, crisp afternoon, Sarah drove to Mark's apartment. It was a modest place, clean and filled with the warmth of a life truly lived. Lily, her eyes wide with recognition, rushed to the door. "You're the bride," she exclaimed, her voice full of a child's unfiltered awe. Sarah smiled, a genuine, unforced smile she hadn't felt in weeks. "I am, and you're the one who kept your dad safe." They sat at the small kitchen table, a simple meal of chili simmering on the stove. Mark and Sarah talked for hours. They didn't talk about the wedding or the ruined dress. They talked about grief, about the struggles of a single parent, about the surprising weight of a life suddenly put into perspective. Sarah told him about her career as a graphic designer, about her passion for old movies, and the slow, creeping realization that the life she had planned with David wasn't a life she truly wanted. Mark, in turn, opened up about the quiet ache of his wife's absence, and how Lily had been the anchor that kept him from drifting away entirely. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lily showed Sarah her sketchbook, a collection of drawings that were equal parts whimsical and poignant. Sarah, with her trained artistic eye, saw a budding talent, and she offered to bring Lily a new set of art supplies. The gesture was simple, but it was a bridge, a quiet promise of a future. That evening, as Sarah drove home, she didn't feel the sting of a broken engagement. Instead, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had been saved from a cliff's collapse, but more importantly, she had been saved from a life that was crumbling beneath the surface. Her life was no longer a carefully staged photograph, but a messy, beautiful, and utterly real canvas waiting to be filled. The next weekend, she found herself not on a treacherous cliff, but on a well-worn trail, holding Lily's hand and walking side by side with Mark. They weren't a couple yet, but their connection was deeper than any romantic gesture. It was a connection born of trauma and forged in hope, a new beginning built on solid ground, with the ocean roaring not in a warning, but in a powerful, endless song of life.